Hey everybody, welcome to Fantastic Firsts, the brand new show from Daventry Studios and our brand new comic book imprint, Comic Book Curator, which, as you probably guessed, deals with comic books primarily. Duh. In this series, our goal is to create, eventually, a database that is concise, consistent, and comprehensive of first appearances in comic books of persons, places, and things. So nouns, basically. That includes teams, races, locations, objects, all sorts of fun stuff. Suits of armor, very prevalent in the Marvel Universe. And to do this, as explained in the intro video, which you'll find in the description section here, we look at three things. One is the comic itself, two is the calendar, and three is the creative intent. So if a comic book creator says that is a particular character, we're going to go ahead and listen to the guy that actually wrote it, or the gal that actually wrote it, as the case may be. The calendar, you might say, well, what shouldn't it be obvious? Yes, it should. But you will see, if you proceed through this series with us, that sometimes there are little hiccups in that logic for some folks, and sometimes people just don't have the full information. We live in a world that we have tons of secondary sources, but not a lot of primary sources. So that's what we're doing. We're looking at the actual comic. We're looking at the actual calendar to see when the comic came out. And then if we need to ask the creator or see what they said, then we ask them and say, hey, is this the same character as this character? Or is this a new character? Or whatever applicable questions. So to start this off, we're actually starting with Marvel because Marvel is my favorite. And we start way back before Marvel was even Marvel. Back in 1939, that's where we start our journey, when Marvel was Timely Comics. Timely would become Atlas, and Atlas would become Marvel. So way back in October of 1939, we have the first Marvel comic, which, surprisingly enough, is titled Marvel Comics, and it's issue number 1. So Marvel Comics number 1. So here we are, taking step 1 on this adventure. Glad you are joining me. Enjoy the ride. So issue 1 here, Marvel Comics 1939, October. Of course, this is going to be obviously a unique issue because it is the first issue. So we're going to have a lot of things flying at us right away. I promise they will die down as we move farther on into the history of things, so we're not seeing such basic first appearances like you'll see me list off here in a minute or so. And we start with the first story in the first comic here, which is the Human Torch. And that makes the Human Torch the first superhero in Marvel Comics. And you'll see there's a little wrinkle to that. We'll get to that in a bit here. So we have the first appearance of Jim Hammond, the original Human Torch, as he's also come to be known. He's actually not a human. He is a synthezoid, so it's the first appearance of a synthezoid in the Marvel Universe as well. It is also the first appearance of his creator, Phineas Horton, and the Scientists Guild. Now, here's the first little wrinkle we have, and this is actually great because we get to talk about these right away in episode number 1. So this is technically a retroactive first appearance. And what a retroactive first appearance is it means that a creator down the line somewhere decided that these characters were someone different than they initially may have been intended. So initially, the Scientists Guild weren't the Scientists Guild. They were just 3 scientists, and later on, they show up again, and they show up again later on, actually, in this issue, but all of those different appearances, when they all lined up and made them the same characters, that fact wasn't revealed until much, much later. So, again, getting back to creative intent, the intent was not to create the Scientists Guild in this issue. It was to create 3 scientists that showed up and evaluated this new creation, the Human Torch. So, the Scientists Guild appears here for the first time in a retroactive first appearance, in that it was later decided they are the Scientists Guild. And their names are Jerome Hamilton, Carlos Zoda, and Maris Morlack. Of course, being that this is the first comic ever in Marvel history, We have some really basic first appearances. We have human beings, Earthlings, if you will, that appear first here. We have the New York City Police. We have the New York City Fire Department. We've got New York State, New York City, the United States of America, Brooklyn. I have a Brooklyn Dodgers hat on here. Very appropriate for the episode. And of course, on a big picture thing here, the first appearance of the 616 universe, which is the main universe that Marvel is set in. And you'll see hints to this actually even in the MCU. I believe it's in Thor: The Dark World when Dr. Selvig is kind of going a little cuckoo, and he's got notes about the multiverse on his blackboard, and there's the number 616 on there. So even there, you'll see references to 616, even though the term isn't really coined until later. This is still the main universe of what will be known as, the Marvel multiverse. And we also have a few first appearances of things. I said a synthezoid, which is what the Human Torch is. There are a few other famous synthezoids that come up in Marvel history, namely the Vision. That's everyone's favorite and probably the most well-known synthezoid. Synthezoids, in this case, in the case of the Human Torch, are made up of Horton cells, which is Professor Phineas Horton's invention to basically take the place of... It's a synthetic material, which is why they're called synthezoids and not androids, rather than straight-up robot materials and gears and stuff like that. So we don't actually see like a container of them here or anything, but because the Human Torch is made of these Horton cells, that is the first appearance of them. So we see them here. The next story stars the Angel, and actually not the Angel from the X-Men. This is the first Angel, and his name is Thomas Halloway, and he is more of a detective type character, kind of like the Spirit and other masked men of that time. It's also the first appearance of New York City Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia. You might know his name because the big airport's named after him, LaGuardia Airport. And the interesting thing about political figures in the Marvel Universe is that there's always been kind of an interesting relationship between them in general and the Marvel Universe, in that sometimes we get real, actual political figures, and sometimes we get stand-ins. So you might see the president be the actual president, and you might see a senator come along that's not a real senator. So it's really up to each writer on a case-by-case basis. So in this particular case, we have the actual mayor of New York City showing up in this issue, in this story called The Angel. That's really it for this particular story in this issue. So we move on to the story that has the most moving parts, and that is the story called The Submariner. And of course, this story features the one and only Prince Namor Mackenzie of Atlantis. And in order to talk about this one, we have to go back a little bit, actually, because this actually isn't Namor's first appearance. His first appearance was in a comic called Motion Picture Funnies Weekly, #1. And that particular comic was intended to be distributed in movie theaters to people that came to watch movies. And it was, again, a comic that was made up of an anthology of stories. And it never really took off, this Motion Picture Funnies Weekly idea. And so it wasn't ever really published. There were only a handful of issues that are out there. Maybe half a dozen, up to 12. It depends on how, or on who you ask, I should say. But there are a couple stories in here that would later make the jump to Marvel Comics #1 and actually Marvel Mystery Comics #2, which we'll also talk about today. And one of those stories is this story about Prince Namor. So we've got a few characters here in this story, namely Namor, his mother, Princess Fen, and the ruler of Atlantis, the Holy One, who we find out years later is named Thakor. And those three characters, along with the groups that they belong to, the Atlanteans, Prince Namor is a Atlantean human hybrid. So that's Namor. That race shows up here for the first time. The Atlantic Ocean shows up for the first time. The Southern Ocean, which is part of the Atlantic Ocean, aka the Antarctic Ocean, and this settlement of Atlantis. So Atlantis moves around a little bit in the comics, and this is the city of Thakor. And so that's close to the Antarctic ice shelves in the southern hemisphere is where Atlantis is at the time of this story. So what you can see in this comic is that you can see, so the first few pages are that first issue, the unpublished story from Motion Picture Funnies Weekly. And then if you look at the last panel from that original story, which is republished here, you'll actually see a text block that is filled in. So it's covered. So it's not, you can't see what it actually was supposed to say. And what it was supposed to say was either to be continued or the end, or there was going to be some continuation. And what they did was they actually continued that story in this issue. So the next few pages are actually the first time that those pages showed up. So we have a character, we have Dorma, that shows up, who actually is in the same story, but makes her first appearance in this issue. So Namor, Fen, the Holy One, this is all just their first Marvel appearance, not their first appearance overall. Dorma, it is her first appearance overall. So most of the time you only see things like this in like licensed characters, where you might have Marvel adapting Star Wars or Evel Knievel, or different things where they have gotten the licenses to print comics about them. Transformers is another one, and they might have previous comic book appearances is what I meant to say. And so this is kind of a more unique situation where these characters were originally published in one magazine. When that magazine didn't take off, they went and repackaged them and threw them in Marvel Comics #1. So they showed up here, which is, I would say, a good thing for comic book readers, because where would we be without Prince Namor? The other dicey thing here is that Namor is technically a mutant because he is part human and part Atlantean. So and even in the comics, they make the distinction between that kind of mutant and the Homo superior kind of mutant of the X-Men, Magneto, and so on. But technically, Namor is the first mutant in the Marvel Universe, and even before really that term was used. So, again, I don't think that's enough to really say this is the first time mutants show up, because as we understand, mutants is generally when we speak of the X-Men and related characters to that. So, if you want to be technical, this is the first appearance of a mutant. And there are further series down the road that Marvel has published called Namor, the First Mutant. And it's just that he is different. He's a different kind of mutant, so it's not quite the same. We also see the Oracle for the first time, which is the ship that Namor's father captained. And we also come up with our first myth, actually, because I've seen a few places cite that this issue is also the first appearance of Namor's father, Leonard Mackenzie, which is false. So what happens in the story is that Leonard Mackenzie is the captain of this ship that goes down. It's basically an expedition, a scientific expedition, and they're doing some testing, and that testing is hurting the city of Atlantis below them. So Atlantis sends a spy who is Namor's mother, Princess Fen, and she, of course, falls in love with this serviceman, and they have a child who is Namor. And if you actually read the story here, when Fen arrives at the surface, she only is shown having one interaction with any of the servicemen, and that is a sailor basically yelling to the rest of the crew, we need to get this gal, we need to bring her to the captain because he needs to know that there's a stowaway here. And there's no other sailors shown. So we know the captain of the ship is Leonard Mackenzie. We know the sailor is referring to the captain of the ship and is not personally the captain of the ship. So he doesn't show up. So we're going to have to wait on Leonard Mackenzie's first appearance because he doesn't show up here. We'll have to wait and see when he does actually first show up. So that is Namor and the story of the Submariner. And of course, that'll be continued in further issues. The next story we have is The Masked Raider. This is a Western, kind of in the style of The Lone Ranger, as you might guess. The first appearance here is of the Masked Raider himself, the first Masked Raider, Jim Gardley, and his horse Lightning. Beautiful white horse that he tames himself, of course. Not quite silver, but lightning. Yep, okay, you got it. California shows up for the first time here, as well as the Eternity Mask. And the Eternity Mask is the mask that is worn by the Masked Raider. And again, this is really cool that all this stuff keeps coming up here in the first issue because we can clarify some things. So the Eternity Mask has a lot more history to it than you would think by just reading these stories. In these stories, initially, it just is a black cloth mask the Raider puts on over his face so you can't see who he is. And later on, it's revealed that it's more significant. So this is the perfect opportunity to go over this because you might say, well, how is that not a retroactive first appearance? Because isn't that the same thing as the Scientist Guild? And it is very subtle and it's kind of nuanced, but it's not. It's different. And here's why. A retroactive, it doesn't have to be first appearance, but a retroactive first appearance or change in the story is something that edits or changes previous continuity to fit the latest story. The Eternity Mask doesn't fit that category. Rather, we find out later that this mask has special properties. It's not that it was changed for purposes of fitting in with later stories. So, the Scientists Guild, when they show up in this comic, the original writer's intention was not to create the Scientists Guild. Later on, again, like I said, they show up in Fantastic Four, 67 and 66 before that. And when that story was written, it was also not intended for them to be those same characters. Later on, it was decided they were the same. But the artistic intention at the time was not for that to be so. Now compare that with the mask in this situation. So, while it may not have occurred to the writer at the time to have this mask be special, nothing about it was changed here. So if we go forward through the history of Marvel, you won't find anything that says, oh, actually, this mask wasn't actually... It was actually a different mask that the Masked Raider had on, and we just showed this differently. This is the same mask. They just built on the story. So it wasn't like, hey, there's this black mask, and then later on they're like, actually, it was a symbiote. And this is the first appearance of a symbiote. That's not what's happening. What's happening is they're saying, this is something new that we found out about the mask. So it's not changing anything in the past. It's just building on the history of this particular object. I hope that makes sense because that is very subtle. So once again, if it's a retroactive appearance, it's changing the past to fit the present story. If it is not a retroactive appearance, it can build off the past. So it's really the same thing as learning that Spider-Man's parents were spies. You're just building off that. Sure, maybe the writer initially, when they brought up Peter Parker and that he didn't have his parents alive anymore, so Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, maybe their original idea wasn't that they were spies, but we find out that they're spies later. That doesn't mess up or change anything in the past. It just builds off it. So, retroactive changes the past. If it's not retroactive, it can be built off it. And that is the case for the mask here, where at the time, we don't know that it has special powers, but later on, it does. But it's still the same mask. The Scientist Guild was not intended to be the Scientist Guild, and then it was changed later to be the Scientist Guild. Hope that makes sense. Let me know if it does or not. But I know I'm probably beating a dead horse here, but I think that is an important distinction to make, especially early on. So, moving on, there's also a really short but fun story called Jungle Terror, and it stars a couple guys named Ken Masters and Tim Roberts, and these guys don't show up again, which is kind of bizarre considering every other story in this issue continues to the next issue in this series. And we have the first appearances of both the Amazon rainforest and Florida in this story. So they show up, but the main heroes don't. So they kind of got the short end of the stick. Never got another story after that. Maybe they will eventually, and then I'll have to go back and say, hey, actually, these are significant characters. But for now, they're just kind of left in the dust. The final story in this book is another kind of unique first. So it's The Adventures of Khazar the Great. And this is the first appearance of the first Khazar. And this is actually a different Khazar, completely different than the one that is going to show up later on, a few decades later, as basically Lord of the Savage Land. That Khazar, his real name is Kevin Plunder. He lives with a saber-toothed tiger and a bunch of dinosaurs. This Khazar is actually an adapted character, so this is going to be our first adapted first appearance. So, first appearance, but not an original character. The original character was created by a gentleman by the name of Bob Bird, and he wrote the first Khazar stories in a pulp adventure magazine a few years previous to this. So this was an adaptation of those stories. Nevertheless, this is the first appearance of the first Khazar. This Khazar being known as David Rand, not any relation to Iron Fist or his family. And so we have the first appearance of young David and the rest of his family, his mom and dad, and his animal companions, or at least the animals that would turn out to be more or less his companions. Czar the lion, who was his best animal friend throughout this series. We have Chaka the ape, and Najaga the leopard, who is decidedly not a fan of humans. And then we also have Traja the elephant. Very similar elephant to Colonel Hathi from the Jungle Book. Very kind of a force of nature as opposed to someone that the other animals pal around with. We also have the first appearance here of Paul DeCraft, who is the main nemesis of Khazar, at least through the first few issues. Khazar calls him Fat Face. Classic. And then the first appearance of the Belgian Congo is in this issue, as well as that is where most of the Khazar stories are set. That wraps up issue number 1. That wraps up Marvel Comics number 1. So we move on to the only other Marvel comic from this year. That is Marvel Mystery Comics number 2. So they actually already changed the title, one comic in, from Marvel Comics to Marvel Mystery Comics. They kept the numbering. So this is Marvel Mystery Comics number 2, coming our way from December of 1939. And this is going to be a lot quicker. As I said, once we get through the first few issues and you get these waves of first appearances knocked down, then you're going to have a little quicker time getting through these comics. So, same format. We have a bunch of different stories starring different characters. And our first story, once again, is the Human Torch story. The only first appearance here is that of Mr. Pete Johnson, who is one of the rare recurring supporting characters in the early Timely universe. A lot of the supporting characters were one and done. The villains taken care of on the first go-round by the superheroes and then didn't show up again. Not even a lot of love interests that really consistently showed up. So for Pete Johnson to show up later in a few other issues is not the norm, but this is his first appearance. To the next story is the Angel once again, and no new characters here. I mean, there's new characters, but no significant first appearances. It is the first appearance of Hong Kong, and this is interesting because, of course, at this time, Hong Kong was not part of the country of China. So I was kind of, on the line here going, okay, well, but like that region is China still, so is this really the first appearance of China? And then I decided, hey, listen, if I'm going to go and really dive down into every geographical or cultural like border, then I'm going to be kind of in trouble as these go along, because I'm going to have a lot of actual world history to mix in, and as much as I do like world history, that's not the point of the show. So Hong Kong's first appearance is here. Of course, one of the biggest port cities in the world, so it does show up, I wouldn't say regularly, but not unregularly. I don't think that's the word. But Hong Kong, here, first time. Next story, back to Namor. And we have two new places, and these are probably the most significant places, and maybe the first, the first time that we see Central Park is this issue, and Manhattan as well. And of course, with most of, especially the early Marvel issues, especially Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, Thor, X-Men to a lesser extent, but sometimes, getting down into New York, Daredevil, a lot of them, of course, because Marvel was headquartered in New York, involve New York, Manhattan, and the surrounding area. Central Park, of course, is a regular in both the comics and the video games. So if you ever play a Marvel video game recently, Spider-Man, the Lego games, most of the time Central Park's there for you to fly/web sling through, and most of the time it's kind of packed with bad guys. And I kind of, why has the park not been, I know it's a big park, so it's difficult, but there's always people hiking, and then like 50 yards away there's like a giant robot killing someone. It's like, oh no, it's just New York, that's how we handle things. Wait for Spider-Man to come in and take care of it, or giant Lego Hulk to come down and smash giant Lego Abomination, and move on. So Central Park and Manhattan show up here for the first time in this story. In the Masked Raider story, Nevada shows up for the first time. That's all we got from the Masked Raider story. And we have a little interesting tidbit here as well, in that there is a text story in here. And text stories became quite common in the Timely and Atlas days when they had these anthology books. They would throw a story that was a couple pages, 2 or 3 pages long, and maybe one illustration in it that may or may not actually match the story. And they would put those in, you'd read about half of it, and then they'd put a couple comic stories in there, and then you'd have to have your patience tested, because you would have to wait for the ending of these text stories later on. And this is a really short one, and it involves the Angel basically hijacking a German Nazi warplane that is bombing a civilian town. And there's an illustration with it that actually matches the story. So this is the first Marvel/Timely/Atlas appearance of Nazis. And it's interesting because when we go a little further down the line, we're going to see a lot of characters, especially in the Captain America comics, and when characters like the Human Torch and Namor get involved in the World War, where there are characters that you are pretty sure are Hitler or Mussolini or the like, and their names are just a little bit off. And it's interesting to see that kind of tiptoeing around, because you have, these stories that have characters that are very blatantly, based on real life characters, but they don't have the exact name, which is actually really interesting. So we'll see that as we go along. Kind of related to that is the last story here, which is American Ace. And this is the same thing as Namor from the last issue, in that this was from the Motion Picture Funnies, and it was lifted and put here. And so this is the first appearance, the first Marvel appearance of the American Ace, the first American Ace, Perry Webb. And he's just a fighter pilot. And this is this ties into that last Angel/Nazi story, in that there are panels here that line up pretty pretty much spot on with some of the key events that led up to World War I, such as the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, and they're depicted here, and everything's the same except the names, basically. So kind of interesting take on things here. And interesting, it's always so interesting as you're going through history reading these, because you get, things like the advertisements and everything as they evolve throughout the years and what they're actually advertising and how many, overnight muscle kits are being sold. But then also the way that history is depicted and the way that, politicians or countries or world leaders or pop stars are, depicted in these comics. So that wraps up Marvel Mystery Comics number 2, and that wraps up 1939. So that wraps up our show. So we're going to move on with our next episode to kick off 1940, and we will play it by ear as far as how much we cover in an episode, because there's some cases where there might be only a half dozen comics for a year or a couple months. And then there might be a month, especially when we get down the road, when Marvel gets into full swing, where the months are full. We might have to take it a month at a time so that we don't have a 10-hour video that you have to sit and digest everything. So thanks for watching. Like and subscribe and all that stuff that that everyone asks you to do. But, do it. That'd be cool. And we will see you next time. Thanks for joining me, and have a good one.